It's an honor to be speaking with you today and to have the opportunity to talk about my book, 10 Restaurants That Changed America. And as Gabriel said, it's not about the best restaurants or the fanciest restaurants, but about what I think are the most influential. And so influential means that there are certain categories that seems to me you have to consider if you're going to write a history of American culinary taste. This means that it's not like I started out with 200 possible restaurants and struggled to narrow it down. People have asked me, oh, how could you ever come up with just 10 when there are so many possibilities? But really, there are certain categories. So for example, it seemed to me you couldn't write a history of the United States restaurants without including a Chinese restaurant. Probably really couldn't without including a Mexican restaurant, but I didn't have space for that. I had space for a Chinese restaurant and an Italian restaurant. And I'll talk a little more later about which categories of restaurants I left out. The first and the last of the restaurants in my list, and I'll mention again what the list is. Delmonico'S, the first, and Chapanese in Berkeley, the last, were no-brainers in the sense that the influence of these restaurants is clear. Delmonico'S set the pattern of the elegant restaurant for beyond the 19th century. It was a byword for elegance, so that, in places as remote as New Bern, North Carolina, the fanciest restaurant called itself the Delmonico'S of New Bern. Chapanese is the founder of the basically most important restaurant philosophy school that exists now, that emphasizes local, seasonal cuisine and the quality of primary products. So I'll talk about the justifications for some of these other ones, but I do want to reiterate that Mama Leone's, for example, very well known all over the country because it was a big tourist destination in New York City. For much of my childhood, their advertisements said, "You haven't visited New York if you haven't dined at Mama Leone's." So they served 3,000 people a night at the height of their fame. Compare that. And so people would say to me in book tours, well, why don't you have Rao's in there or some other famous Italian restaurant that arguably had better food? But the point is not better food. The point is those 3,000 people a day created a greater impact on American perceptions of Italian food and American perceptions of what for a long time has been called ethnic cuisine than more selective places like this place Rao's that comes up with a lot of Northeastern audiences, which is essentially a club. You can't even eat there unless you have a kind of membership. So the restaurants are Delmonico'S in New York, which was founded in the 1830s, the first real restaurant in the US. And by real restaurant, I mean more than just an inn, or a place to refuel with very little choice of what to eat, and certainly much more than a stand or takeout place. The second restaurant is Antoine's in New Orleans, founded in 1840, and so almost as old as Delmonico'S, an example of regional cuisine in the United States. Probably the most intact regional cuisine is that of Southern Louisiana, which has two, right? The Creole cuisine of the city of New Orleans and the Cajun cuisine of the rural areas west of New Orleans. The third restaurant is Schraff's, and that's SCHRAFFT''S. This was a small chain. The first branch was in Syracuse, but it was particularly popular in the Northeast between Boston and New Jersey. It was founded at the end of the 19th century, and I have it in there as an example and pioneer in two trends. One is middle-class dining, and by that I mean the whole spectrum of restaurants between the fancy places like Delmonico'S and working men's cafes or luncheonettes or diners or more modest eateries. And then more important even than middle class, I think, is that Schrafft's was founded and designed to cater to women. And not just to women in terms of atmosphere, because there were already sort of ladies' tea houses and restaurants with a kind of nicer and less club-like decor, but to cater to what were perceived now as female tastes in food. And I'll come to what that is in a moment. The next restaurant is Howard Johnson's. This formerly was the largest chain of restaurants. In 1960, it served more people than any other American restaurant or institution, with the exception of the US Army. Now there's only one left in upstate New York near, I can't remember if it's Lake George or Lake Champlain. But Howard Johnson's invented the family-friendly restaurant. It invented franchising. It invented roadside predictability. A question that comes up a lot is, why didn't I include McDonald's? And part of the answer is that you couldn't have McDonald's without Howard Johnson's. Howard Johnson's is the parent or ancestor of McDonald's because of the franchise, the instant recognizability, the predictability, and its orientation towards the automobile. Then two ethnic restaurants, Mama Leone's, an Italian restaurant that I already mentioned in New York, and the Mandarin, a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco. The next restaurant is Sylvia's in New York City, an African-American restaurant that presents itself as a soul food restaurant, a down-home restaurant, and a Southern restaurant. And these three separate but overlapping categories are part of the African-American culinary story, but also they're about African-American influence. The eighth restaurant is the elegant mid-century French place called Le Pavillon in New York City. French to its fingertips, founded in 1940, closed in 1974, but it epitomizes the elegant taste of the mid-century, as does the ninth restaurant, the Four Seasons. The Four Seasons was founded in some ways to resemble Le Pavillon and some ways as the antithesis, resembling it in a high-end service, elegance, and very different because of its ultra-modernist decor. Its interior was landmarked, and its resolutely non-French cuisine. In 1959, when it was founded, it was very daring to have an expensive restaurant that didn't serve French food. What kind of food it did serve, it's a little hard to say. Let's say it's American eclectic. And then the final choice in my lineup, Chapanese in Berkeley, the creator of local seasonal dining. And if you ask restaurateurs and people in the food writing world, what is the most influential restaurant now, it is still Chapanese 50 years after its founding in 1971. So things that I left out or would have included if I'd had space, delicatessens, barbecue places, diners, steakhouses. I mentioned Mexican restaurants. I'd say those are the five principal things. In fact, I asked my publisher at one point, because I was just really having trouble getting from 12 to 10, if maybe it should just be 12 restaurants that changed America. And he was very negative on that idea. The 10 has a kind of mystical attraction. You don't have the top 10 pop hit, the top 12 pop hits. So that's the story for that. Let me say that my idea in writing this book was, as Gabriel said, to talk about how American food has been formed, to point to some examples that are influential, but also to talk about American history through food. I can talk about this a little more if you're interested, but I think food is both a vital and yet regarded as a kind of trivial topic. It's ephemeral, right? You eat a meal and it's gone. On the other hand, you listen to a piece of music and it's gone. And music has been considered a serious subject of study since ancient Greece. Why food is not considered, or until recently has not been considered a serious topic of study, we don't really have to deal with that. It's something that is of great interest, not only because we all like to eat and are interested in different tastes, but it says something about society. It says something about race, about gender, about ethnicity, about immigration, about nation. What is American food anyway? So that's the kind of general context. Let's start with the restaurants, with Delmonico's. Delmonico's was created in 1827, and it was at first just a pastry shop, but it had immediate success. It had wonderful pastries, the best coffee in New York, and it soon expanded into an actual restaurant with a gigantic menu. You might expect that the menu of early restaurants would be quite restricted, but in Paris, which really invented the modern restaurant about 50 years before Delmonico's opened, and in New York, right from the start, the menu is huge. The first menu we have from Delmonico's is from 1838. It's in French. The restaurant claimed to be French. In fact, it's called, is referred to as Le Restaurant Français des Frères Delmonico, the French restaurant of the brothers Delmonico. Two things to observe about this. One, it wasn't actually completely French. The menu was in French, but they had a lot of American specialties like terrapin or turtles, which was a great delicacy of the time. Wild canvasback ducks, along with terrapin, the two major elegant dishes of the 19th century. Baked oysters or cooked oyster dishes. England and France, all of Europe have oysters, but they don't tend to have cooked oyster dishes. That's an American development. And Delmonico's invented things like baked Alaska in honor of the purchase of Alaska from Russia in the 1870s by the Secretary of State, William Seward, or negotiated by Seward. The Delmonico steak, lobster Newburg. So these are all American dishes, even though the restaurant said that it was French. So you'll see that of my restaurants, half of them are either French, claimed to be French, or reacted against France. And I'll just say that this is because French cuisine defined high-end dining until really the 1980s. After the 1980s, the world becomes more decentralized when it comes to food. You have the most celebrated restaurant at the turn of this century was in Catalonia, a place called El Bulli, which invented molecular gastronomy, or modernist cuisine, as it's sometimes called. Catalonia was succeeded by Denmark and Scandinavia, and then Peru or Thailand. I mean, so the decline of French domination is maybe the major story of restaurants and culinary taste of the last 50 years. The second restaurant, Antoine's, also called itself French and also wasn't exactly French. It was by no means a slavish imitation of France, partly because the ingredients of the region of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast are so different from France. So things like pompano or the kinds of sausage that they have in Louisiana, rice dishes like jambalaya may have some French touches, but they're essentially different. So from the start, Antoine's made things like bouillabaisse, which is a Southern French Provençal dish, but with very different ingredients. But they too, like Delmonico's, invented all sorts of things that had nothing to do with France. Their most famous invention is Oysters Rockefeller. This is a baked oyster dish with a green kind of sauce whose ingredients are unknown to all but two people, and literally very hard to duplicate or even to come close to. The owner knows the recipe, and then there's one other person who knows it. I'm not sure who that is, but that's in case the owner dropped dead suddenly. But Antoine's invented dozens and dozens of dishes over the years, including lots of other oyster dishes, oysters Bienville, oysters Foch. They had a kind of roast beef called Bœuf Robespierre, a rather grisly story. The original Antoine, who emigrated from France in the 1830s, had seen the execution of the French revolutionary leader Robespierre. And this beef Robespierre was very rare. And so what the French call saignant, the juice was bloody. Okay, so much for Antoine's. Schrafft's is the third restaurant. As I said, a small chain that pioneered the notion that women have particular tastes in food. This was not really an idea until the late 19th century, except that women were always supposed to be partial to sweet food, and also as a sort of separate category that women had particular desires for odd foods in pregnancy. But in the late 19th century, you get the pattern that is still, if not dominant, it's still at least known to everybody, and that is that women don't like very hearty or very spicy food. They like bland and light food, except that they love very sweet and elaborate desserts. And I'm not saying that this is true. I will say that my fond memory of going to Schrafft's was with my grandmother, who would order what then was considered to be a light dish, cottage cheese with fruit. And then that gave her the excuse to have, to balance that out, a banana split or a chocolate fudge sundae. So it's not that restaurants were off limits to women in the 19th century, but there were few places that women could go to alone or with other women without being harassed by men, or at least stared at by men. And also restaurants catered to what would become to be perceived as male tastes. Things like kidneys with fines herbes, or calf's head with brain sauce, or duck with olives, curry, chili, things like that. So Schrafft's lasted until the 1980s. It sort of rose and fell with its identification with upper middle class women, when upper middle class women no longer liked to be thought of as fussy people who didn't work and loved shopping and card games. The restaurant could not salvage itself. The quintessential middle class restaurant is, of course, Howard Johnson's, which was not only friendly to women, but friendly to children, which is a hard thing to do, as you well know. Children love restaurants, but they also can be disruptive. Howard Johnson's was originally an ice cream vendor, and it became a restaurant first in Quincy, Massachusetts, then along Cape Cod, and it developed a standardized repertoire. It was not a fast food place because not only did it, you had to sit down in it. It didn't have, like drive-through or anything resembling that. It had a very large menu. It had, 200 menu items. It had sort of standard things that you would expect, like frankfurters and hamburgers. But its most famous dish that I think most people our age who remember Howard Johnson's from their childhood was fried clams. And fried clams or fried fish, fish fry in the 60s. The fried clams are actually counterintuitive. They were something that before Howard Johnson's retailed them were only eaten in the far eastern parts of the Atlantic seaboard, New England, Maine, Cape Cod. They're also not easy, clams are not something that keeps very well, and took real genius to figure this one out. I think the reason that fried clams were so popular is that they cater to the three things that Americans love in combination, unlike most other people. Americans like salty, sweet, and spicy foods. So barbecue sauce, for example, or the kinds of American salad dressings that people in Europe think are barbarically sweet. So then the so-called ethnic restaurants. Mama Leone's exemplifies two of the three phases of Italian food as served to people who were might or might not be Italian. The first phase is the Bohemian phase, the Italian restaurant identified with neighborhoods like New York's Greenwich Village or San Francisco's North Beach. The kind of place I'm talking about, the Chianti bottle with a candle on the table, red checked tablecloth, somewhat operatic waiters, and an atmosphere of fun and good times, and inexpensive. The second phase, which Mama Leone, and Mama Leone, the original Mama Leone, had this little restaurant that catered to people from the Metropolitan Opera in New York, which was around the corner. It then moved and expanded, became a gigantic restaurant, and sort of the Italian restaurant as palatial, inexpensive, and serving a huge amount of food. Mama Leone's had a 6-course meal, and the first course, the so-called antipasto, consisted of 12 plates of different little appetizers. I would say it's fair to describe its strengths as quantity rather than quality, although I talked to someone who was the manager of Mama Leone's before it closed in the 1990s, and he said not only did they make all their own pasta, but their food was tremendously fresh because of the volume. They knew exactly how much to order. If you have a restaurant with only 12 tables, you may end up with a lot of veal that didn't get ordered or fish that didn't get used. You're gonna have to figure out some way of using it. If you have a restaurant that's serving 3,000 people per day, then you know exactly how much lobster to order, you know exactly how much veal to order, because at that scale, the fluctuations are very small. The next restaurant is the Chinese restaurant, the Mandarin in San Francisco. And part of the reason I chose that was its owner, the late Cecilia Chang, who died, I guess now about 10 months ago. Was a wonderful character. I had more fun with this restaurant than any other. And she had an amazing life and many extraordinary experiences. There are at least 2 film documentaries that record this. But she also wrote 2 memoirs with recipes, and they talk about the restaurant a lot. And if you think of it, there are 40,000 Chinese restaurants in the United States, and 30,990 something are, have no records, or if they have records, they're not in a language that I can read. So, to some extent, as is always the case with historians, I'm at the mercy of what has been preserved and what is accessible. This is a wonderful restaurant that pioneered sort of regional, northern, and high-end Chinese food. I did my undergraduate and graduate work out in California, and so the Mandarin was the first place I think I had pot stickers, the first place I had hot and sour soup, and a number of other northern Chinese delicacies. So Sylvia's in New York, in Harlem since 1962, exemplifies African-American cuisine, which originated in the South. Obviously, at the end of the Civil War, 90% of the African-American population in the US was in the South. And the Great Migration of African-Americans to the North and to the Northern Midwest began around World War I and ended in about 1970. And this brought huge numbers of Southern Black people to the North. Sylvia Wood herself, her grandfather had been lynched by a mob who accused him of a crime he had not committed. She was from Hemingway, South Carolina. Her family, in some sense, fled the intolerable conditions of Jim Crow, the Jim Crow South. On the other hand, she retained a tremendous affection for Hemingway, returned there all the time, maintained a house there, sent her children there for part of the time. And she described her food at first as Southern or down home. Later, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when soul food became the identifying mark or nomenclature for African-American food, her restaurant was called and called itself, Sylvia's, the queen of soul food. But soul food really meant Southern food: fried chicken, barbecue, rice and greens. And its history exemplifies the fraught but intimate relations between Southern Black and white populations, which you can see in culinary history as well. Le Pavillon returns us to the high end, and it's on the list because, just like Delmonico's, it represents for what for a long time was the trend-setting international cuisine, that is to say, French food. Le Pavillon really was French. Its owner and maitre d', Henri Soulet, remained French to the end of his life, although he became an American citizen. He was very fond of the United States. He had been the maitre d' of the restaurant attached to the French Pavilion of the New York World's Fair of 1939-40, hence Le Pavillon, pavilion. During the second year of that fair in 1940, France fell to the Nazis very suddenly in late May and early June of 1940. And although the manager of the restaurant went back to Paris, most of the staff, led by Soulet, stayed in the United States as refugees. And Soulet opened a restaurant called Le Pavillon in the seemingly unpropitious fall of 1941, not long before Pearl Harbor and the American entry into World War II. As it happens, it was a stunning success right from the start, rationing or not, and continued to really be the dominant restaurant in the United States for more than 25 years. Soulet has a lot to answer for insofar as people think, and in my opinion unfairly, that all French restaurants are arrogant, or that French people are intolerant of Americans. Soule, who was a terrible snob and who invented the whole idea of, Siberia. Siberia is the part of the restaurant that nobody's are seated at, and the favoritism of stars or the elite of the time, people like Jackie Kennedy or the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. He really perfected. On the other hand, as I said, he was devoted to the United States in his own way. It has to be said, he went back to the south of France, where he had grown up every summer, and only after he died did it turn out that he actually was married and that his wife lived in southern France. And then not finally, but second to finally, the Four Seasons. The Four Seasons just closed about 2 years ago. And it is not only important for the reasons I mentioned before, modernist, elegant decor, and a kind of brilliantly eclectic, original, somewhat American-based cuisine. It also has a social importance. It was the first place that the term power lunch was applied. So it's not that people hadn't had, social connections at lunch before, but the power lunch is more austere and businesslike than the Duke and Duchess of Windsor would have wanted, nibbling on caviar. A power lunch is someplace where you do deals, where you have maybe the minimal amount of alcohol because you're going to go back to the office. One of the people who participated in the power lunch at its height in the late 1970s remarked, "It's great, I can have a paillard of chicken, do some deals, and be back at my office at 2 o'clock. So a reminder of the restaurant as a place of sociability and deal making, not just of cuisine. And then finally, Chapanese. Alone of the restaurants I've worked on, Chapanese has been written about a lot. I think I've added something to its story by reason of comparison with other American restaurants, but also, its name is French. It began as a French restaurant. I focus on the story of how a restaurant that 50 years ago wanted nothing better than to be like a Michelin one-star restaurant in France, very close imitation of a French auberge, a sort of French country restaurant. How did that become the exemplar of California cuisine? So the 10 restaurants that I've included are, in effect, a chronological narrative from 1830 to the present. Also, they're a selection of types: French high-end, regional, ethnic, African-American, New American. So I think these histories show a number of trends, both social and gastronomic. The erosion and survival of American regional cooking, the role of women as customers and as restaurateurs, I should say. It was not my intention, but 4 of the 10 restaurants were created by women: the Mandarin, Mama Leone's, Sylvia's, and Chapanese. I think these restaurants also show the pressures of efficiency and standardization on American businesses, the importance of immigration as well as internal migration, particularly of African Americans. Each restaurant has its own peculiar story, but what I hope is attractive about this book is the variety of these separate and colorful histories, which form a unified narrative about American taste and how that taste was formed. In the time remaining, I'd be glad to hear your comments or answer questions.
Okay. Hi. I had a very funny story that happened when I was newly engaged to my husband. And he took me to Mama Leone's, and we couldn't figure out the menu and whatever. And there was, what is it? It starts with a P and it's ham.
Prosciutto.
Prosciutto, right. So I didn't know what it was. I was from Ohio. I was a stupid kid from Ohio. And they so we asked the waiter who could not speak English. And he had such a difficult time. And then he shows me running around on the floor. A little, it's this big, and he shows me the size. I said, dog? And he said, yes, yes.
Well, that's a wonderful story.
It was funny. I'll never forget it. My God, 60 something years ago.
That's hilarious. So this would be the 1960s.
Right. Yes. I married him in 61. Right.
That's marvelous. That's great. Mama Leone's, every time I think of it now, there's a sort of special aspect to it. I wrote the book in manuscript, and it was copy edited. I had someone proofread it for me, and I had a picture editor. You sort of need to have such people because they get the permissions to reproduce, and they find pictures, and particularly to get permissions is a nightmare. And so I paid this guy to do this, and he said, oh, by the way, I noticed that in your book you spell mama M-A-M-A apostrophe S. And in fact, looking at the menu, it's M-A-M-M-A apostrophe S. The Italian mamma has two M's, whereas the English mama has one. And it was just in time. Nobody else had caught that. And I suppose it would have been embarrassing, the way people not only tell you of your mistakes, but tell the entire internet that you screwed up.
First of all, thank you so much. That was just mind-boggling how little I knew about the history, and you really show a wonderful reflection of how it shows a shaping of our country. That said, I know you're a historian, but if you were to cast a little bit of future on what we have today, do you have any restaurants that you have noted that might make your next 10 restaurants that influence America?
Okay, well, there's sort of two responses that I'll combine. One is, which would I want to put in? And then, as I said before we started, the paperback edition of my book has 10 restaurants that are changing America now being 2018 when it was published. So I might do it differently. But as best as I can remember, the 10 restaurants that I thought were changing America now were, one was a vegetarian restaurant because, like it or not, that is certainly one of the major trends. And that was called Dirt Candy in New York City. But I also included 11 Madison Park in New York, which at the time in 2018, I simply included because, it was the #1 ranked restaurant in the US, but more than that, it kept on changing. Usually if you have a #1 or highly ranked restaurant, you do the same thing, like the Tour d'Argent in Paris has been serving pressed duck since, I don't know, 1880. And, they always have pressed duck. Places, Peter Luger always has steak. If they just decide, we're tired of steak, we're gonna have an all a vegan cuisine, it would be suicidal. But that's exactly what 11 Madison Park has done. I say nothing about the idea that vegan food should be priced at $500 a person, but that's so that's a trend as well. Change. So there's a restaurant in Chicago called Next that just has a different kind of cuisine every 6 months. There's a restaurant in New York called Intersect where they actually just invite guest chefs. So they had a chef from a Jewish restaurant in Buenos Aires for 6 months, and then they had a restaurant in Goa, and then an African-American restaurant in Savannah, Georgia. So change is another obvious trend. taking the farm to table, even further, two restaurants that interested me at the time were Husk, which was then in Charleston, South Carolina. Now I think the main branch is in Nashville, Tennessee, where they're not only concerned with, fresh produce, but produce from, heirloom breeds, not just tomatoes, but the kind of rice that they had in South Carolina before, kind of industrialization of agriculture. And then a place in Westchester County, which is where I live, north of New York City, called Blue Hill Stone Barns, which also has a tremendous emphasis on, the right breeds of very basic ingredients like wheat, and to get at a more authentic and more robust taste of the past. Categories that I also had the Jewish restaurant, or Israeli restaurant as it calls itself, Zahav in Philadelphia. As I said, one of the things that I left out was delis. But now if you were going to write about Jewish food in the United States, and I did something on this for the University of Haifa. I was supposed to go there and give a talk, but obviously it was remote. Sephardic food has suddenly become, not suddenly, but over the last few years, fashionable because, of course, it's semi-Mediterranean. It's not as based on, chicken fat or meat. It is perceived as light. It has a more spicy spectrum of flavors. And there is no such thing really as Israeli cuisine. And restaurants in Israel don't call themselves Israeli, but Israeli in this context means Jewish eclectic. So you can have kugel, but also baba ganoush, or their hummus is great. That sort of shifts in ethnicity, globalization, are another trend that I guess I would identify for the future.
I just wanted to, this is off the side with the restaurants, but I've taught many years religious school in the different congregations. And one thing, I would teach the little ones, but when I would see them when they're in college or whatever, the first thing they would say to me from all the subjects that I taught was the food.
Wow,
And
that's fascinating.
they would say, oh, you spend all this time talking, Bible stories and, history and all this other stuff. But it was always the case that they would remember the latkes, they would remember the hamantaschen, all the different, for high holidays, we do the different kinds of things with apples. But it was just the first thing they would say. And this is like universal with my older kids that went off to college and had families of their own, was the food, which
Yeah.
I thought ours is trying to prepare a class. And the first thing they would say to me is that they remembered the different foods that we made in class.
That's great. And as a teacher, I also am aware that people will come back and tell you things that they remembered that you weren't aware that you had even emphasized. And so I guess that's an argument for openness, but it's also, it's very gratifying. I teach a course on the history of food to undergraduates. It's very interesting also to ask them what they miss from home. Foreign students particularly, or students from, kind of non-suburban backgrounds. And the Yale dining is about as good as college food gets, but nevertheless, there's a tremendous amount of food homesickness, I guess I'd describe it. Particularly, obviously, foreign students. I had a student actually from Bangladesh who said, the thing I can't get used to is having to eat with a fork and knife. She grew up eating with, her right hand, and there are all sorts of rules about how you do that. It's not, it's not crude, but she said, I eat with a fork and knife. It's like I'm not tasting the food. It's just sort of like coming in there, almost like it was intravenous. And it's taken me a long time to get used to that. I thought that was fascinating. I will say that the things that European students don't like are what I mentioned before, the intrusion of sugar into a lot of things like, glazed ham or salad dressings, maple syrup. They don't get maple syrup, and also the quality of the bread.
I thought it was interesting a number of years ago where I was working, and we had a secretary that came in for the program manager from New York, and she happened to be Black. And her main complaint in Denver was she couldn't get good delicatessen out here.
Ah, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, by the way, that reminds me of one thing that I was going to say, although none of you have reproached me with it, and that is, I was interviewed by a radio station in St. Louis, and they said, well, all your restaurants are on the East Coast or West Coast. Like one exception is Antoine's, and it's on the Gulf Coast. Is this because you have no experience with the interior of the country? You're from New York and you teach at Yale, which was on the book jacket. And I actually, before I came to Yale, I taught at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. And I lived in Tennessee for 18 years. So I have at least some, non-coastal part of the country credibility. And, I wasn't aiming to foreground New York restaurants or California restaurants. A lot of trends, began in New York and California, partly because of immigration. So, my mother always told me not to be defensive about things that people haven't brought up, but what you say reminds me of that. Yeah, and in Nashville, I never complained about the bagels because, if I wanted, if bagels were the most important thing in life, I would have stayed in New York City. So, and then eventually, actually, in the 1990s, they had wonderful bagels. They developed wonderful sushi and all sorts of things. And after I left, the New York Times had, a feature article in its food section about Nashville, the latest gastronomic destination. So the coastal domination is, I think, to some extent a thing of the past. But the past is what I concern myself with as a historian, having said that.
There's one thing I find interesting and disturbing, apart from the pandemic, but it seems like restaurants, we get magnificent restaurants in Denver and they don't last.
Really?
They just, I don't know what it is. We had turn of the century a number of years ago. They just, it seems like they just can't make it. I don't know whether this is due to the influx of people from various other parts of the country or exactly what it is.
I think you would expect that in a booming place like Denver, the restaurants couldn't keep up with the demand. But the restaurant business is fragile. There are ways of making money, particularly at the sort of middle level. But once you start getting towards the high end, the cost of ingredients, the cost of insurance, rent, labor, even though restaurant work is notoriously poorly paid, restaurants have the same problem that academia does, and that is what's called the string quartet problem, sort of a business textbook example. In Mozart's time, it took 4 people to play a string quartet, and a pair of shoes took, let's say, 90 hours for a shoemaker to assemble, to make. In 2021, the cost of making a shoe has plummeted. It doesn't take, anything like 90 hours. They come off of industrial machines in seconds, but it still takes 4 people to play a string quartet. So therefore, the cost is very, very high. People still prefer waiters. I mean, this is why delivery and takeout and drive-through and all these things are desirable, but to the extent that people still want a live experience and real choice, it's a very hard business to make money in. It's a dream that a lot of people are pursuing. Interestingly enough, in the areas that I'm familiar with in the Northeast, lots of restaurants closed. Probably 1/5 of all the restaurants in New York City closed permanently, but a huge number of them opened up because the rents were lower. The main expense for restaurants is not the food, in fact. This is one reason why American portion size is so huge. The restaurant needs to charge you $30 for that pasta. And in order to make you feel better about that, they'll give you a huge quantity because the expense of the food is usually about 22%. Their real expenses, labor, insurance, rent. So this has the, I think, bad effect of this gigantic portion size. Bad because many people, like myself, will sort of eat what's put in front of them. And so I end up having more food at restaurants than I'd really planned on or actually needed. Other people like it because then they can take some home. I get that, though. That's partly you're doing the restaurant's job for it. You're saving them their hauling expenses, their trash expenses.